Dear Mrs. Holloway, my name is Denise Alderman. I am writing to inform you that your husband, Richard James Holloway, is also my husband. We were married in the state of Georgia on June 14th, 2005. We have 3 children together. I'm sorry you are finding out this way, but I believe you deserve to know the truth. Maggie Holloway read those words standing in her kitchen at 10:47 on a Tuesday morning in April of 2019, while her coffee was still warm on the counter and her youngest daughter was at school, and the house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when nothing has gone wrong yet. She read the letter once and her hands started shaking. She read it a second time, and her vision blurred because her eyes were filling with tears she did not understand yet. Then she read it a third time, and something inside her chest collapsed, not like a broken heart the way people describe in songs, but like a floor giving way beneath her, like the ground she had been standing on for 18 years had never been solid at all. When she sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and the letter in her lap, and she stayed there for almost 40 minutes before she could make her body move again. Because in that moment, Maggie Holloway realized that the life she had built, the marriage she had trusted, the family she had believed in with every single part of her heart, was a complete and total fabrication. The man she had shared a bed with for 18 years, on the man who had held her hand in the delivery room when both of their daughters were born, the man who kissed her goodbye every Monday morning and told her he loved her every single night. That man had another wife, not an ex-wife, not a woman from before they met, a current wife, a woman he had married 3 years into his marriage to Maggie, a woman who lived in a house he paid for with money he stole from Maggie's savings, a woman who had given him 3 children that Maggie never knew existed. And that was only the beginning. Because what Maggie did not know yet, what she would not discover for another 3 agonizing weeks, was that the deepest betrayal in this story would not come from Richard at all. It would come from someone she loved even more than her husband. It would come from her own daughter. This is the story of a woman who thought she knew everything about her life and was wrong about all of it. This is the story of a man who built 2 complete families in 2 different states and maintained the lie for 14 years without a single crack in the mask. This is the story of a mother-in-law who knew and said nothing, a sister-in-law who knew and said nothing, and a 16-year-old girl who carried her father's secret for 2 years because he begged her to and she loved him too much to say no. This is a story about what happens when every person you trust decides that the truth is too dangerous to tell you. And this is a story about what happens when a woman who has been lied to by everyone finally decides that she is done being the last one to know. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is Beyond Betrayed. And this story is going to stay with you long after it ends. Now, before we take you back to the beginning, before we show you how this whole thing started and how it all fell apart, you need to understand something about this story that separates it from every other story of infidelity you have ever heard. This is not a story about a man who had an affair. This is not a story about a husband who made a mistake one night and spent the rest of his life regretting it. No, this is a story about a man who looked at the institution of marriage and decided to turn it into a system, a machine, a carefully engineered operation designed to extract money, loyalty, love, and silence from 2 women who never knew the other one existed, and he did not do it alone. That is the part of this story that will make your stomach turn. Because Richard Holloway could not have maintained this lie for 14 years without help. He needed people to look the other way. He needed people to keep their mouths shut when every fiber of their conscience was screaming at them to speak up. And he found those people in the most devastating place imaginable, inside Maggie's own family. Over the course of this video, we are going to answer 3 questions that will take you on a journey from a quiet suburb outside Charlotte, North Carolina, to a modest house in Valdosta, Georgia, 340 miles south, where a woman named Denise Alderman was living a life that was a mirror image of Maggie's in almost every detail. Question number 1 is this: how did Richard Holloway maintain 2 complete families, with 2 wives and 5 children in 2 different states for 14 years, without ever getting caught? How did he manage the schedules, the holidays, the birthdays, the phone calls, the bank accounts, the lies upon lies upon lies? And how did he do it so well that neither woman suspected a thing for over a decade? Question number 2 is harder, and it is the question that nearly destroyed Maggie more than the affair itself. Who in Maggie's own family knew the truth? And why did every single one of them decide that protecting Richard was more important than protecting her? And question number 3 is the one that will keep you watching until the very last minute of this video. Because this is the question that changes everything. What did Maggie do when she discovered that the person who had betrayed her most deeply, the person whose silence hurt more than Richard's lies ever could, was not her husband, was not her mother-in-law, was not her sister-in-law, but was someone so close to her heart that the revelation nearly broke her in a way she did not think she could survive? To answer these 3 questions, we need to go back to the very beginning, back to a small town in North Carolina, where a young woman named Maggie Dawson believed that the safest thing in the world was family, and the most reliable thing in the world was love. Margaret Ann Dawson was born in 1977 in Shelby, North Carolina, a town of about 20,000 people tucked into the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where everybody knew everybody and most families had lived on the same streets for 3 or 4 generations. It was the kind of town where you could leave your front door unlocked and nobody thought twice about it. The kind of town where the biggest event of the year was the high school football game in October and the church potluck in December. The kind of town where people married young and stayed married and raised their children the same way they had been raised, with church on Sunday morning and supper on the table by 6. Maggie was the middle child of 3 sisters. Now her older sister Linda was the loud one, the one who had opinions about everything and was not afraid to share them. Her younger sister Beth was the adventurous one, the one who moved to Raleigh after college and came back for holidays with stories about restaurants that served food nobody in Shelby had ever heard of. And Maggie was the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the one who sat between her sisters at the dinner table and made sure nobody's feelings got hurt. Now I'm the one who remembered everybody's birthday without being reminded. The one who always put other people's comfort ahead of her own. Not because she did not have needs of her own, but because somewhere along the way, she had learned that being needed was the closest thing to being loved, and she had gotten very good at it. Her father, Earl Dawson, worked at the textile mill on the edge of town for 31 years until it closed in 1998. And then he worked part-time at the hardware store, because Earl was not the kind of man who could sit still, and he was not the kind of man who believed in feeling sorry for himself. Her mother, Lorraine, was the church organist at First Baptist and ran the women's auxiliary, and could stretch $1 further than anyone Maggie had ever met. They were not wealthy. They never took vacations. The family car was always at least 8 years old. But the mortgage was paid on time every month, and there was always a pot roast on Sunday, and Earl would sit on the porch in the evenings and wave at every single person who walked by, because that was the kind of man he was, steady, reliable, present, the kind of father who showed up, and Maggie loved him for it in a way that went deeper than she could ever put into words. Maggie graduated from Appalachian State University in 1999 with a degree in elementary education. She got a job teaching 2nd grade at a school 12 miles from the house she grew up in. She sang in the church choir. She visited her parents every Wednesday evening for supper. She had a small apartment above a garage on Elm Street, and she was content in the way that people are content when they have not yet been disappointed by the world, when they still believe that if you do the right things and love the right people and keep your promises, life will keep its promises back. Maggie was not looking for excitement. She was not looking for someone to sweep her off her feet. She was looking for what her parents had, something solid, something honest, something that would last. And in the summer of 2001, at a 4th of July cookout, hosted by a mutual friend in Gastonia, she met a man named Richard Holloway, and she believed with every part of her heart that she had found exactly what she was looking for. Richard James Holloway was 28 years old when he arrived in the Shelby area in the spring of 2001, and he arrived the way men like him always arrive, with a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, and a story that was just complicated enough to be interesting, but not so complicated that you would ask too many questions. He said he was originally from Augusta, Georgia. He said he had moved to North Carolina for a fresh start after a relationship that did not work out. He said he was working as a regional manager for a trucking logistics company, which was a job that sounded respectable, and explained why he traveled so much. 2 days a week, sometimes 3, occasionally 4. He was polite in the way that Southern women notice. He held doors, he pulled out chairs, he called women ma'am and he called men sir, and he shook hands firmly, and he looked you right in the eye when he spoke to you. He went to church. He volunteered at a food drive. He brought flowers to Maggie on their second date and a book of poetry on their third. And when Maggie's mother, Lorraine, met him for the first time, she pulled Maggie aside in the kitchen afterward and whispered, "That one is a keeper, sweetheart. And don't let him go." Maggie's sister Linda would later say something about Richard that perfectly captures what made him so effective. She said, "He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Like he saw you, really saw you. Not just what you looked like or what you did for a living, but who you were underneath all that." And for a woman like Maggie, who had spent her whole life being the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who took care of everyone else, being seen like that was like oxygen. They dated for 11 months. Richard proposed on a Saturday afternoon in October of 2001 on the front porch of Earl and Lorraine's house, with Earl's blessing and Lorraine's tears, and a ring that was modest but beautiful, because Richard said he did not believe in flashy things, he believed in real things, and Maggie believed him. They were married the following June at First Baptist Church, 212 guests. Maggie wore her grandmother's veil. Earl walked her down the aisle and cried for the first and only time Maggie had ever seen. The reception was in the church fellowship hall, and Richard danced with Lorraine, and everyone said they had never seen a more perfect couple. It was, by every account, the happiest day of Maggie's life. It was the day she believed she had been rewarded for being patient, for being good, for being the kind of woman who waited for the right man instead of settling for the wrong one. And she had absolutely no way of knowing, not a single clue, not a whisper of doubt, that the man standing across from her at that altar, the man who was promising to love and cherish her until death do them part, had already made that exact same promise to another woman. Richard Holloway was already married. He had been married since 1997 to a woman in Georgia, and he had never filed for divorce. And the marriage license he used to marry Maggie was obtained with forged documents. The life he presented to her, the backstory about Augusta and the bad breakup and the fresh start, was a fabrication from beginning to end. And the most terrifying part of all of this is that nobody knew. Not Maggie, not her family, not their friends, not their pastor. Nobody. Because Richard Holloway was not a man who made mistakes. He was a man who made plans. Over the next several years, Maggie and Richard built what appeared from the outside to be a beautiful, enviable, thoroughly American life. They bought a 3-bedroom house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Mint Hill, a suburb just east of Charlotte, with a backyard big enough for a swing set and a front porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. They had 2 daughters. Sophie was born in 2003. Min and Maggie said that the moment the nurse placed Sophie in her arms, she understood for the first time what people meant when they said that love could physically hurt, because her chest ached with how much she loved that tiny, squirming, red-faced baby. Emma came 3 years later in 2006, quieter than Sophie, more watchful, the kind of baby who studied your face before she decided whether to smile at you. Maggie left teaching to raise the girls full-time. Now, it was not a difficult decision because Richard's career was going well and the money was good enough, and Maggie had always believed that the most important job a woman could have was being present for her children, the way Lorraine had been present for her. Richard traveled a lot for work, 2 days a week at first, then 3, then sometimes 4. He would leave on Monday morning with a suitcase and a kiss, and he would come back Wednesday night or Thursday morning with a gift for the girls. A stuffed animal from the airport, a coloring book, once a tiny porcelain cat that Sophie kept on her nightstand for years. He called every single night at bedtime, without fail. Maggie would put the phone on speaker, and Richard would tell the girls a story, usually something silly he made up on the spot, about a magical dog named Biscuit who went on adventures. Nara and Sophie would laugh, and Emma would listen quietly, and then Maggie would take the phone off speaker, and Richard would tell her about his day and ask about hers and say, "I love you, Maggie," before he hung up. And she would go to sleep feeling safe in a way that she had not felt since she was a child in her parents' house. She had no reason to question any of it. The calls came on time. The money was in the account. The mortgage was paid. The man came home. He remembered anniversaries. He showed up for school plays. He coached Sophie's softball team one spring. He grilled burgers on the 4th of July and wore a ridiculous apron that said, "Kiss the cook," and made everyone laugh. He was the perfect husband, Maggie would later say. And when she says it now, Her voice breaks in a way that makes you want to look away, because the pain in those 4 words is almost unbearable. And that is what made it so evil, because none of it was real. Not a single moment. Every phone call at bedtime, every gift from the airport, every time he told me he loved me, it was all part of the same performance. And I was the audience who never knew she was watching a show. What Maggie did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that on the days Richard was supposedly traveling for work, he was 340 miles south in Valdosta, Georgia, a small city near the Florida border. He had a house there. He has a 3-bedroom house with a blue front door and a magnolia tree in the yard. He had a wife there. Her name was Denise Alderman, and he had married her in 2005, 3 years after marrying Maggie, using a different set of forged documents. He had 3 children there, a son named Tyler, born in 2006, and twin daughters, Grace and Lily, born in 2009. He told Denise the same things he told Maggie. He traveled for work, 2 days a week, sometimes 3. He always called at bedtime. So he always came home with gifts. He always said he loved her. It was the exact same script performed for a different audience in a different state, and he executed it with the precision of a man who had no conscience and no fear of being caught. 2 families, 2 wives, 5 children, 340 miles apart, and for 14 years, from 2005 to 2019, nobody said a word. Not because nobody knew, but because the people who knew made a choice, every single day, to stay silent. The way the truth finally reached Maggie Holloway was almost absurdly ordinary. It came in the mail. Not through a dramatic confrontation or a private investigator or a slip of the tongue at a family gathering. It came in a white envelope with no return address, mixed in with an electric bill and a catalog from a clothing store Maggie had ordered from once 2 years ago and kept getting catalogs from ever since. It was April 14th, 2019, a Tuesday. Sophie was 16 and in school. Emma was 13 and also in school. Richard was traveling. Maggie had dropped Emma off, come home, poured herself a cup of coffee, and stopped at the mailbox on her way back up the driveway, the way she did every single morning, because that was her routine. And Maggie was a woman who believed in routine the way some people believe in prayer. She opened the white envelope standing at the kitchen counter, and she almost did not finish reading it, because for the first several sentences, her brain simply refused to process what her eyes were seeing. It was like trying to read a language she did not speak. The words were English, but they did not make sense. Not in the context of her life, not in the context of the world as she understood it. The letter was handwritten on plain white paper. 2 pages. The handwriting was neat and careful. The handwriting of someone who had written multiple drafts before settling on this one. The handwriting of someone who understood the weight of what she was about to do. The woman identified herself as Denise Alderman. She said she lived in Valdosta, Georgia. She said she had been married to Richard James Holloway since June 14th, 2005. She said they had 3 children together, a son and twin daughters. She said she was writing this letter because she had recently found a second cell phone hidden in the glove compartment of Richard's truck. And when she looked through it, she found text messages and photographs and call logs that made it clear Richard had another life, another family, another wife in North Carolina. Denise wrote that she had spent 2 weeks going back and forth about whether to send this letter. She wrote that she had lost 11 pounds in those 2 weeks because she could not eat. She wrote that she knew this letter would destroy Maggie's world, and she was sorry for that, but she believed that Maggie deserved to know the truth. Because she, Denise, had spent 14 years not knowing the truth, and she would not wish that on anyone. Denise included evidence. She included a photocopy of her marriage certificate to Richard. She included a photograph of Richard standing in front of a house Maggie had never seen, holding a baby Maggie had never met, smiling the exact same smile he smiled in the photographs on Maggie's own mantelpiece. She included a printout of a bank statement showing deposits into an account Maggie did not know existed. The evidence was not ambiguous. It was not the kind of thing that could be explained away or misinterpreted or dismissed as a misunderstanding. It was clear, and it was devastating. And it was sitting on Maggie's kitchen counter, right next to the electric bill, as if the destruction of an 18-year marriage was just another piece of Tuesday's mail. Maggie would later say that the strangest part of that morning was the silence. The house was so quiet. The coffee maker was still making its little ticking sounds as it cooled down. A bird was singing outside the kitchen window. The world had not changed at all. Yeah, the sun was still shining and the dishes were still in the sink, and the grocery list was still on the refrigerator, and everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago. Except that 5 minutes ago, Maggie Holloway was a woman with a husband and a home and a life she understood. And now she was a woman sitting on a kitchen floor, holding a letter that proved none of it had ever been real. Maggie called Richard's cell phone 11 times between 11:15 in the morning and 4:30 in the afternoon. He did not answer a single call. She called the main number for his company, and the receptionist said he was traveling and would not be reachable until the following day. She called his cell phone again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. She left one message. She said, "Richard, call me. Now." She did not say why. She did not mention the letter. Some part of her, some instinct she did not fully understand at the time, told her to keep the element of surprise, because if she told him what she knew over voicemail, he would have time to prepare, time to construct a new lie, time to get his story straight before he had to face her, and Maggie was done giving Richard time. At 6:47 that evening, Richard called back. His voice was normal, casual. He said, "Hey babe, sorry I missed your calls. It's been a crazy day." "Yeah, what's going on?" And Maggie asked him one question. She said, "Who is Denise Alderman?" Richard went silent. Not for a second or two, the way a person goes silent when they are confused by a question they do not understand. He went silent for 9 seconds. Maggie counted. She would later tell a therapist that she counted those 9 seconds the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder to figure out how far away the storm is. And in those 9 seconds, she knew. And she knew that everything in the letter was true. She knew it because an innocent man, a man who had never heard that name before, would have said "who" immediately, reflexively, without hesitation. But Richard did not say "who," because Richard knew exactly who Denise Alderman was. He knew her middle name and her birthday, and the names of their children, and the color of the front door of their house in Valdosta. And in those 9 seconds of silence, Maggie could practically hear the machinery of his mind working, calculating, sorting through options, trying to figure out how much she knew and how much he could still deny. When Richard finally spoke, his voice had changed. It was softer now, gentler. The voice he used when Sophie was upset about something at school or when Emma had a bad dream. The comforting voice. The safe voice. And that made Maggie angrier than anything else because even now, even in this moment, he was performing. He said, "Maggie, listen to me. I can explain. That woman is disturbed. She has been stalking me for months. She is obsessed with me and she has been making up these stories, and I was going to tell you about it, but I did not want to worry you until I had it handled. Please, just let me come home and I will explain everything, I promise you. It is not what you think." Maggie let him come home. Not because she believed a single word he said. She let him come home because she wanted to sit across from him at the kitchen table and watch his face while he lied to her one last time. She wanted to see it up close. She wanted to memorize exactly what a man looks like when he is lying to the woman he swore before God to love and protect. Because she realized in that moment that she had been watching that face for 18 years and had never once recognized it for what it was. Richard arrived home at 11:30 that night. He walked through the door with flowers. Flowers. Maggie almost laughed because it was so perfectly, grotesquely him. He sat down at the kitchen table, and he started talking, and he talked for almost an hour, and every single word out of his mouth was a lie. He said Denise was a former colleague who had developed an unhealthy attachment to him. He said the marriage certificate was forged. He said the photographs were manipulated. He said the bank statements were fabricated. And he had an explanation for everything, and his explanations were smooth and detailed and delivered with the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of practice. And if Maggie had not been holding the letter in her lap, if she had not spent the entire day staring at a photograph of her husband holding another woman's baby, she might have believed him. That is how good he was. That is how practiced and polished and utterly convincing Richard Holloway was when he lied. But Maggie had the letter. She had the photograph. She had Denise's handwriting and Denise's pain and Denise's marriage certificate with Richard's signature on it. And she knew that signature because she had seen it on their own marriage certificate, and on their mortgage, and on the birthday cards he signed for the girls. And it was the same signature. Exactly the same. So Maggie sat there and she listened and she let him talk. And when he was finished, she placed the photograph on the table between them, the one of Richard holding Denise's baby in front of the house with the blue door. And she said, "Richard, stop. I know." And for the first time in 18 years, Maggie saw her husband's real face. Not the charming face, or the loving face, or the concerned face, or the patient face. His real face. And it was blank. Completely blank. Hey, like a screen that had been turned off. What happened over the next 72 hours was the most painful and clarifying period of Maggie Holloway's life. She told Richard to leave the house that night. He went to a motel. She did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a legal pad, and she did something she had never done in 18 years of marriage. She stopped trusting and she started investigating. She pulled up their joint bank statements online and began going through them line by line, month by month, year by year, and what she found made her physically sick. There was a second bank account. Richard had opened it in 2007, 2 years after marrying Denise, at a bank Maggie had never heard of. Over the course of 12 years, more than $340,000 had moved through that account. Money that came from their joint savings, money from a life insurance policy that Maggie did not even know had been cashed out, money from automatic transfers that Richard had set up to pull small amounts each month, 200 here, 300 there, amounts small enough that Maggie never noticed because she trusted Richard to handle the finances, and he had always told her they were doing fine. But the transfer that broke her, the one that made her put her head down on the kitchen table and cry in a way she had not cried since her father's funeral, was a single wire transfer dated September 18th, 2015. $87,000. The exact amount of the inheritance her father, Earl, had left her when he passed away that August after a long battle with lung disease. Earl had worked at that textile mill for 31 years. He had saved every penny he could. He had told Maggie before he died that he wanted her to have something solid, something that was hers no matter what. And he had left her $87,000 in a savings account that Lorraine had helped him set up specifically for Maggie. When Maggie received the inheritance, Richard had sat with her at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where he would later lie to her face. And he had said, "Sweetheart, let me invest this for you. I know a diversified portfolio that will grow this into something really special for the girls' college fund." And Maggie had said yes because she trusted him, and because she did not know anything about investing, and because this was her husband. And why would her husband lie to her about her dead father's money? Richard had even shown her quarterly statements, printed on official-looking paper with charts and graphs and percentage signs. Every 3 months, a new statement arrived showing the money growing. 6% here, 8% there. A beautiful fiction printed on expensive paper. The money had never been invested, not a single dollar. Richard had wired all $87,000 directly to the bank account in Valdosta the same week Maggie signed it over to him. He had used her dead father's legacy, the money Earl Dawson had spent 3 decades saving, knowing to pay the mortgage on the house where he lived with his other wife and his other children. And he had kissed Maggie goodnight the evening he did it. Maggie contacted a lawyer the next morning. His name was David Chen, a family attorney in Charlotte who had handled exactly 2 bigamy cases in his entire career, and would later say that Maggie's case was the most elaborate he had ever seen. David explained that bigamy was a felony in North Carolina, a Class 1 felony punishable by up to 12 months in prison. He explained that it was also a felony in Georgia, where the second marriage had taken place. He explained that the financial fraud, the identity fraud, the forged documents, the stolen inheritance, all of it could form the basis of additional criminal charges. He explained that Maggie had options, legal options, real options, options that could hold Richard accountable in a court of law. So Maggie listened to all of it, and she thanked David, and she drove home, and she sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the house she and Richard had bought together, the house where she had brought her babies home from the hospital, the house where she had cooked 10,000 dinners and folded 10,000 loads of laundry and gone to sleep 10,000 nights believing she was safe. And she understood for the first time that the law could punish Richard, but it could not fix what he had broken inside of her. Because the damage was not financial. The damage was not legal. The damage was to her ability to believe in anything, to trust anyone, to look at another human being and take their words at face value. Richard had not just stolen her money and her years and her father's inheritance. He had stolen her ability to feel safe in the world. And the law does not have a statute for that. But none of that. Not the financial fraud, not the bigamy, not the forged documents, not even the theft of Earl's inheritance. None of it prepared Maggie for what she was about to discover next. Because the deepest wound in this story, the one that would cut all the way to the bone, was not about Richard at all. 3 days after confronting Richard, Maggie drove to Patricia Holloway's house. Patricia was Richard's mother. She was 71 years old, and she lived in a small ranch house in Gastonia, about 30 minutes from Maggie's home in Mint Hill. She had been a part of Maggie's life for 18 years. She had been at the wedding. She had been in the waiting room when Sophie was born, and again when Emma was born. She came to the house for Thanksgiving every year, and she always brought the same sweet potato casserole. And she always told Maggie that her turkey was the best she had ever had, and she always hugged the girls goodbye so tight that Sophie would joke about it in the car on the way home. Maggie loved Patricia. Not in the complicated way that some women love their mothers-in-law, with layers of resentment and competition and unspoken tension, but genuinely. Maggie loved Patricia because Patricia had always been kind to her, had always treated her like a daughter, had always made her feel like she belonged in the Holloway family. And Maggie drove to Patricia's house that morning, fully expecting to find an ally, a fellow victim, another woman who had been deceived by Richard's lies, and who would hold Maggie's hand and cry with her and say, "I had no idea, sweetheart. I am so sorry." That is not what happened. Maggie sat down at Patricia's kitchen table and told her everything. She showed her the letter. She showed her the photographs. She showed her the marriage certificate and the bank, the marriage certificate, and the bank statements. And she laid it all out piece by piece. And she watched Patricia's face the entire time, looking for the shock, looking for the horror, looking for the moment when Patricia's world would collapse the way Maggie's had collapsed on that Tuesday morning in her own kitchen. But Patricia's face did not change. There was no shock. There was no horror. There was a long, heavy silence. And then Patricia Holloway looked at her daughter-in-law, the woman her son had been lying to for 18 years, and she said 7 words that Maggie will hear in her head for the rest of her life. She said, "I told him this would happen eventually." Maggie did not respond immediately because her brain could not immediately process the implications of that sentence. Now she stared at Patricia, and Patricia stared back, and in that silence, the entire truth rearranged itself in Maggie's mind, like a kaleidoscope turning and showing a completely different pattern made from the same pieces. Patricia knew. She did not just know about the affair. She knew about Denise. She knew about the marriage. She knew about the children. She had met the children. She had held Tyler and Grace and Lily in her arms, the same way she had held Sophie and Emma. She had visited the house in Valdosta. She had sat at Denise's dinner table. She had spent Christmases there, the same Christmases when she told Maggie she was visiting a friend from church in Florida, because Valdosta was close enough to the Florida border to make the lie geographically plausible. Maggie asked Patricia how long she had known. Patricia said she had known since 2008, which meant she had known for 11 years. 11 years of Thanksgivings and birthdays and school plays and Wednesday phone calls and Sunday dinners. 11 years of looking Maggie in the eye and smiling and hugging her and telling her that her turkey was the best she had ever had, while carrying a secret that would have blown Maggie's entire life to pieces. Maggie asked her why. "Why did you not tell me? Why did you let me live like this? Why did you let me raise my daughters in a marriage that was a lie?" Now, Patricia's answer was delivered without hesitation, without emotion, as if she had rehearsed it 1,000 times in her head, which she probably had. She said, "He is my son." What was I supposed to do? Destroy his life? And Maggie looked at this woman she had loved for 18 years, this woman she had trusted and confided in and cared for and cooked for and treated like a second mother. And she said, "You didn't destroy his life, Patricia. You destroyed mine. You had 11 years to tell me the truth, and you chose him every single time. Every single time you saw me, every single time you hugged my children, every single time you sat at my table and ate my food and smiled at my face, You were choosing to protect the man who was robbing me of my life, and I will never forgive you for that." Maggie stood up and walked out of Patricia's house, and she never went back. If the revelation about Patricia was devastating, what came next was almost worse. Not because the betrayal was bigger, but because it was closer. Karen Holloway was Richard's younger sister. She was 43 years old, married with 2 kids of her own, and she and Maggie had been close in a way that went beyond the typical sister-in-law relationship. They had been friends. Real friends. The kind of friends who texted each other memes at midnight, and met for coffee on Saturday mornings, and talked about things they did not talk about with anyone else. Here, their fears about their children, their frustrations with their husbands, their secret dreams, the small private things that women share only with the people they trust most deeply. Karen had been in the delivery room when Sophie was born. She had held Maggie's hand during labor, and she had cried when Sophie took her first breath, and she had been the first person besides Richard to hold the baby. They had gone on family vacations together, and Karen's kids and Maggie's kids played together every weekend. Their husbands grilled together in the backyard, while Karen and Maggie drank wine on the patio and laughed about things that were not particularly funny, but felt hilarious in the moment because they were together and they were happy and the evening was warm and the kids were safe and life was good. Maggie called Karen 4 days after confronting Patricia. She had spent those 4 days hoping, praying, as bargaining with God that Karen would be different, that Karen would be the one person in the Holloway family who had not known, who had been kept in the dark the same way Maggie had been kept in the dark. But when Maggie said the words, when she told Karen what she had discovered, Karen did not gasp. Karen did not say, "Oh my God," or "What are you talking about?" or "That is impossible." Karen went quiet, the same kind of quiet that Patricia had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that is not the absence of words, but the presence of guilt. And then Karen said, "Maggie, I am so sorry." Not, "Sorry this happened to you," or "Sorry you're going through this." She said, "I am so sorry," in the way that people say it when they are apologizing for something they did, and Maggie knew. Karen said she had found out about 5 years earlier. She said she had been at a family barbecue at Patricia's house, and she saw a text message flash across Richard's phone from someone named Denise with a heart emoji. And instead of ignoring it or assuming it was nothing, something made her pick up the phone and look. And what she found in that phone was enough to understand the entire truth. She confronted Richard privately. He broke down, he cried, he said he was in over his head, and he did not know how to get out. Then he begged Karen not to tell Maggie. He said he was going to end things with Denise. He said he was going to come clean. He said it would destroy the family, destroy the girls, destroy everything. And he just needed time to figure out how to do it the right way. And Karen believed him. She believed him for 5 years. 5 years of knowing the truth. 5 years of looking Maggie in the eye every Saturday morning over coffee. Of 5 years of birthday parties and holidays and phone calls and text messages and inside jokes and shared secrets. And Karen kept every single conversation going as if nothing had changed, as if the foundation of Maggie's entire life was not a lie that Karen was helping to maintain. When Maggie asked Karen how she could do it, how she could sit across from her at a coffee shop and laugh about their kids and talk about their dreams and pretend that everything was fine when she knew that Maggie's husband had another family in another state, Karen said something that stopped Maggie cold. Karen said, "I was protecting you. You wouldn't have been able to handle it." And in that moment, Maggie understood something about betrayal that she had never understood before. She understood that the people who betray you rarely think of themselves as villains. They think of themselves as protectors. They tell themselves that the lie is a kindness, that the silence is a gift, that you are better off not knowing because the truth would hurt too much. And they genuinely believe that, which is what makes it so hard to forgive, because they did not stay silent out of malice. They stayed silent out of a cowardice they had convinced themselves was love. Maggie thanked Karen for her honesty, then she hung up the phone. She never spoke to Karen again. In the days that followed, something happened to Maggie that she was not expecting. She began to doubt everyone, not just the Holloways, everyone. If her mother-in-law could smile at her for 11 years while hiding the truth, if her closest friend could drink wine with her on Saturday nights and know that her entire marriage was a fraud, then who else knew? Yeah, what if it was not just Richard's side of the family? What if the silence went further than she had imagined? What if the people she trusted most, her own people, her own blood, had known too? She called Linda first. Linda, her older sister, the loud one, the one with opinions about everything. Maggie could barely get the words out before Linda started screaming. Not at Maggie, at the situation, at Richard, at the sheer audacity of it. No, Linda said things about Richard that cannot be repeated in this video. And then she said, "I am getting in my car right now. Do not move. I am coming." She called Beth next. Beth, the younger sister, the adventurous one in Raleigh. Beth answered the phone laughing about something that had happened at work, and within 30 seconds, she was sobbing so hard she had to pull over to the side of the road. Both sisters drove to Maggie's house that night. Linda arrived first. Walked through the front door without knocking, dropped her bag on the floor, and wrapped her arms around Maggie and held her without saying a word for almost 10 minutes. Beth arrived an hour later and did the exact same thing. They stayed for a week. They slept on Maggie's couch and on the floor of the guest room. They cooked meals that Maggie barely touched. They screened phone calls. They held Maggie while she cried, and they sat with her in silence when she did not want to talk, and they made her laugh once, just once, on the third night, when Linda said something so outrageously inappropriate about what she would do to Richard if she ever saw him again, that Maggie laughed for the first time in days, and then immediately started crying again, because laughter felt foreign and wrong and too close to normal. Maggie's sisters had not known. Not a whisper, not a hint, and not a suspicion. They were exactly who Maggie believed them to be: loyal, honest, present, real. And in the wreckage of everything that had fallen apart, their presence was the first thing that did not feel like a lie. It was a small thing, but in a life where every foundation had crumbled, even a small, solid thing felt like something to hold on to. With Richard out of the house and the full scope of the deception beginning to emerge, Maggie's lawyer, David Chen, recommended she hire a forensic accountant. Her name was Deborah Klein, and she worked out of an office in uptown Charlotte that was so neat and organized, it looked like a photograph in a magazine about people who have their lives together, which is probably why Maggie started crying the moment she sat down in Deborah's chair, because her own life had never felt more chaotic and out of control. Deborah spent 6 weeks going through every financial document she could get her hands on, and what she found would eventually form the backbone of the criminal case against Richard Holloway. The second bank account was only the beginning. Richard had also opened 3 credit cards in Maggie's name without her knowledge or consent. He had used her social security number to apply for them, and he had made minimum payments on them for years to avoid triggering any alerts, and the combined balance on those 3 cards was just over $41,000. He had refinanced the mortgage on the Mint Hill house twice, in 2011 and again in 2016, each time pulling out equity and diverting the cash to the Valdosta property. Maggie had signed the refinancing paperwork both times because Richard had told her they were restructuring for a better interest rate, and she had believed him because she had no reason not to. So he had redirected Maggie's state and federal tax refunds for 4 consecutive years by changing the bank account information on their returns. The refunds were modest, between $2,000 and $4,000 each year, but they went directly into the Valdosta account, and Maggie never noticed because Richard handled the taxes. The total financial damage, when Deborah Klein finished her audit and presented the final number to Maggie in a conference room at David Chen's office, it was approximately $620,000. That is how much Richard Holloway had stolen from his wife over the course of their marriage. Not in a single dramatic theft, but slowly, methodically, in amounts designed to go unnoticed, like a man removing sand from a beach, one handful at a time, until one day you look up and the shoreline has changed. But the number that haunted Maggie was not 620,000. It was 87,000. Her father's money, an Earl's money. 31 years at the mill, packed lunches instead of eating out, a used car instead of a new one, vacations that never happened, luxuries that were never indulged, all so that Earl Dawson could leave his middle daughter something solid when he was gone. And Richard had taken it. He had taken it and he had spent it on another woman's house and another woman's children, and he had handed Maggie fake investment statements and kissed her goodnight, and slept soundly beside her as if the money in his pocket was not soaked in the sweat of a dead man who had loved his daughter more than anything in the world. Maggie said that when Deborah showed her the wire transfer, the one dated 2 weeks after Earl's funeral, She did not cry. She said she felt something go cold inside her chest, something that had been warm her entire life. And she knew that whatever that warmth was, trust or hope or faith in the basic goodness of people, it was gone now. And she was not sure it would ever come back. What happened next is the part of this story that Maggie still cannot talk about, without stopping to collect herself, nay, without pressing her fingers against her eyes and taking a breath so deep it sounds like it comes from the bottom of the ocean. It was the first week of May, about 3 weeks after the letter arrived. The house was different now. Richard was gone. His clothes were gone from the closet. His truck was gone from the driveway. The bedtime phone calls had stopped. Sophie and Emma knew that their parents were separating, but they did not yet know why. Nay, because Maggie was trying to figure out how to tell her daughters that their father was not the man they thought he was, without destroying them in the process. Emma was handling it the way 13-year-olds handle things they do not understand, with anger and silence, and a door that slammed more often than it opened. But Sophie was different. Sophie was quiet in a way that was not normal for her. She was a girl who had opinions about everything, who debated with her teachers and argued with her mother and talked on the phone with her friends for hours. And now, she was silent. She came home from school and went straight to her room. She barely ate. She did not laugh. She sat on her bed with her phone in her hand and stared at the screen without typing anything. And Maggie assumed it was shock, assumed it was grief, assumed her daughter was processing the separation the way teenagers process upheaval, by withdrawing into their own world and waiting for the storm to pass. But one evening, Maggie walked past Sophie's room and heard something through the closed door. Crying. Not the kind of crying Sophie did when she was angry or frustrated or disappointed. This was something else entirely. This was the sound of a person being crushed by something they could not carry anymore. No, the sound of someone breaking under a weight that had been pressing down on them for so long that their bones could not hold it anymore. Maggie opened the door. Sophie was sitting on the floor with her back against her bed, her phone on the carpet beside her, her face in her hands. She was shaking. Maggie sat down next to her and put her arm around her daughter and said, "Baby, talk to me. Whatever it is, now we will get through it together." And Sophie looked up at her mother with a face that was swollen and red and exhausted in a way that no 16-year-old's face should ever look. And she said 5 words that changed everything. She said, "Mom, I already knew." The room went still. Maggie did not move. She did not speak. She sat there with her arm around her daughter, and she felt the meaning of those 3 words move through her body, like something physical, like a blade, not sharp and fast, but slow and deep, the kind of wound that does not bleed immediately because the body does not understand yet what has happened to it. Sophie had known. Her daughter had known. Maggie's own child, the baby she had held in the delivery room while her heart ached with love, the girl she had read bedtime stories to and driven to school every morning and watched grow up year by year, had known about Denise, about the other family, about the lies. Sophie had known for 2 years. She told Maggie the whole story through tears that would not stop. She said she was 14 when it happened. She said she had been looking for a charger in her father's truck and had found a phone she had never seen before. She said she opened it because she was 14 and curious, and she did not think there was anything wrong with looking at her dad's phone. She saw text messages from a woman named Denise, photographs of children she did not recognize, and a text from Richard that said, "I love you and the kids. I'll be home Thursday." Sophie said she stared at that text for a long time because it was the same thing her father said to her mother every Monday morning. "I'll be home Thursday." The same words, the same promise, given to 2 different families in 2 different states by the same man. Sophie confronted Richard. She did not tell Maggie first. No, she went straight to her father because she was 14 years old, and he was her dad, and she believed that whatever this was, he would explain it. He would make it make sense. He would tell her it was not what it looked like. But Richard did not explain. Richard cried. He sat in his truck in the driveway with his 14-year-old daughter, and he cried and he told her he had made terrible mistakes, and he was going to fix everything, and he just needed time. And he begged her. He begged his own child not to tell Maggie. He said it would destroy the family. He said it would break her mother's heart. He said Sophie was the only one who could help him keep things together while he figured out how to make it right. He told his 14-year-old daughter that the survival of their family depended on her silence. And Sophie, not because she was 14 and because she loved her father and because she loved her mother and because she was terrified that speaking the truth would blow apart the only world she had ever known, said yes. She said she would keep his secret, and she kept it for 2 years, 730 days of knowing that her father was a liar and her mother was living a lie, and that she, Sophie, was the only person standing between the truth and the destruction of everything she loved. 730 days of sitting at the dinner table and pretending everything was fine. 730 days of watching her mother trust a man who did not deserve it and not being able to say a word. 730 days of carrying a weight that would have been unbearable for a grown woman, let alone a child. Maggie did not feel anger towards Sophie. That is the part of this story that surprises people. But if you understand what kind of mother Maggie was, it does not surprise you at all. Maggie looked at her daughter shaking on that bedroom floor, and she did not see a betrayer. She saw a victim. She saw a 14-year-old girl who had been manipulated by the same man who had manipulated Maggie herself, except that Sophie had been manipulated in a way that was arguably even more cruel because Richard had weaponized the one thing Sophie could not resist. He had weaponized her love, and he had taken his daughter's love for her mother and twisted it into a cage. He had told Sophie that silence was loyalty, and that secrecy was protection, and that the way to love her mother was to lie to her. And Sophie had believed him because she was a child, and he was her father, and children are supposed to be able to trust their fathers. Maggie held Sophie on that bedroom floor for 45 minutes. Neither of them spoke, and there was nothing to say that could undo 2 years of silence or uncarry the weight that had been pressing down on Sophie's shoulders since she was 14 years old. All Maggie could do was hold her daughter and let her cry and silently make a promise to herself that she would spend the rest of her life making sure that Sophie understood she was not to blame for any of this. Richard had failed them both. He had betrayed Maggie with his lies, and he had betrayed Sophie by forcing her to become a keeper of those lies. And in that moment, on that bedroom floor, Maggie Holloway understood that the man she had married was not just a liar and a thief and a bigamist. He was a man who would sacrifice his own daughter's peace of mind to protect himself. And there is no word in the English language strong enough for what that makes a person. 6 weeks after the letter arrived, Maggie did something that nobody in her life expected. She picked up the phone and called Denise Alderman. She did not call to confront her. She did not call to scream at her or blame her or accuse her of anything, because Maggie understood by now that Denise was not the enemy. Denise was another version of herself, another woman standing in another kitchen reading another letter that proved her life was a lie. And the only difference between them was that Denise had found out first and had been brave enough to write the letter that Maggie would never have received otherwise. They spoke for 3 hours. Maggie sat on her back porch with a blanket over her shoulders, even though it was warm enough that she did not need one. And Denise sat on her front steps in Valdosta with a glass of sweet tea. Again, and they talked the way two survivors talk when they realize they have been through the same war from opposite sides of the same battlefield. Denise told Maggie her story, and it was like listening to a recording of her own life played back with different names and different locations, but the same script, word for word. Denise had met Richard in 2004 through a friend of a friend. He told her he was divorced. He told her he worked in logistics. He traveled frequently. No, he was charming and attentive, and he made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. They married in 2005 in a small ceremony in Valdosta. They had Tyler in 2006, and the twins, Grace and Lily, in 2009. Richard called every night at bedtime. He brought gifts when he came home from his trips. He told Denise he loved her, and she believed him because he gave her no reason not to. The schedule was the same. The lies were the same. The bedtime calls were the same. Even the words were the same. Denise said that when she finally compared notes with Maggie, they discovered that Richard had been using the same pet names, the same phrases, the same compliments with both of them. He told both of them they were beautiful. He told both of them he was lucky. He told both of them that family was the most important thing in the world. It was not just a double life. It was a carbon copy, a franchise of deception. Yeah, and both women were living inside the same lie without knowing the other one existed. But Denise had discovered something that Maggie had not yet uncovered. During her own investigation into Richard's finances, Denise had found a third bank account. Not the joint accounts he shared with either wife. Not the second account he used to transfer money between families. A third account, in his name only, at a bank in Jacksonville, Florida. The balance in that account was over $185,000. Cash. Sitting there. Untouched. Denise's theory, which the forensic accountant would later confirm, was that Richard had been skimming from both families for years, taking a percentage off the top of every transfer, every redirected refund, every stolen deposit, and squirreling it away in a personal account that neither wife knew about. He was not just maintaining two families, he was profiting from them. Then he was treating his marriages like accounts receivable, extracting value from both households and storing the surplus for himself. Richard Holloway had not just been living a double life. He had been running an operation, and both of his wives had been the product. In August of 2019, 4 months after the letter arrived, Maggie Holloway and Denise Alderman made a decision together, side by side, as two women who had been through hell separately and had found each other on the other side. They went to the authorities, together. They walked into the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's office in Charlotte with David Chen at their side and 3 boxes of evidence, financial records, marriage certificates, forged documents, fake investment statements, phone records, and the testimony of 2 women who had been married to the same man at the same time for 14 years. The case moved quickly. Richard James Holloway was arrested at his logistics office on a Thursday afternoon in September of 2019. He was at his desk when the officers arrived. He did not run. He did not resist. He stood up, straightened his tie, and said, "I was wondering when this would happen," which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man Richard Holloway was. He did not panic because he had always known this day might come. He had simply calculated that it would come later, or not at all. And he had been wrong about the timing. He was charged with bigamy, financial fraud, identity theft, and forgery. The case was covered by local news stations in both Charlotte and Valdosta, and for a brief period the story went regional, picked up by stations across the Southeast, who ran it under headlines like "The Man with 2 Families" and "Double Life Dad Arrested." Richard's defense attorney, a man named Gerald Patterson who specialized in white-collar criminal cases, now attempted a defense strategy that was as insulting as it was predictable. Patterson argued that the bigamy was a personal family matter that had been blown out of proportion. He argued that the financial transfers were spousal disagreements about money management. He portrayed Richard as a flawed but fundamentally loving man who had gotten in over his head and made poor decisions driven by a desire to provide for his children. He actually said that in court. He said Richard's motive was providing for his children, as if the man who had stolen $87,000 from his dead father-in-law's inheritance to pay for a second family's mortgage was motivated by fatherly devotion. The prosecution, led by an assistant district attorney named Rachel Morrison, was methodical and devastating. She presented 1,400 pages of financial records. She presented phone logs showing that Richard had called Maggie and Denise on the same nights, not often within minutes of each other, using 2 different phones. She presented the 2 marriage certificates side by side. She presented the forged investment statements Richard had created to hide the theft of Maggie's inheritance. She called Deborah Klein, the forensic accountant, who walked the jury through every transaction, every transfer, every stolen dollar, with the clinical precision of a surgeon. And she called Maggie and Denise to testify, one after the other, and they had 2 women telling the same story about the same man. And when the jury looked at their faces and heard their voices and understood that both of these women had been living inside the same lie for 14 years, the outcome was never in doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Richard Holloway was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay $412,000 in restitution, a number that represented only a fraction of the total damage, but was the maximum the court could impose under the sentencing guidelines. When the verdict was read, Maggie did not cry. She did not cheer. She said she felt nothing, which scared her more than the anger ever had, because feeling nothing in a moment that should have felt like victory meant that something inside her had shut down. Some part of her emotional circuitry had been damaged in a way that a guilty verdict could not repair. The law had held Richard accountable. But accountability and healing are not the same thing, and Maggie was beginning to understand that the second one was going to be much harder and take much longer than the first. In the months following Richard's conviction, something happened that Maggie had anticipated but had hoped against hope would not come to pass. The Holloway family closed ranks, not around Maggie and the girls. Around Richard. Patricia Holloway gave an interview to a local newspaper in which she said that Maggie was blowing things out of proportion and that every family has its problems, and that she wished Maggie had handled this privately instead of dragging the family through the courts. She said this about a woman whose husband had committed bigamy and stolen $600,000 from her. She said this about a woman whose dead father's inheritance had been used to fund a second family. She said this, and she said it publicly, and she did not appear to feel an ounce of shame. Karen unfriended Maggie on every social media platform and blocked her phone number. Richard's cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends, people who had been at Maggie's wedding, people who had held her daughters as babies, people who had eaten at her table and slept in her guest room and borrowed her lawn chairs for their own parties, every single one of them chose Richard. They did not call Maggie, so they did not check on the girls. They did not send a card or a text or even an awkward thinking of you emoji. They simply erased her, as if 18 years of shared history, 18 years of Christmases and Easters, and 4th of Julys and random Tuesday evenings could be deleted as easily as a contact from a phone. Maggie said that losing the Holloways was not like losing a family. It was like discovering that the family never existed in the first place, that the warmth and the belonging and the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself had always been conditional, and the condition was that you never made things uncomfortable, never forced anyone to confront the truth, never threatened the careful architecture of silence that held the whole thing together. The moment Maggie refused to be silent, the moment she chose truth over comfort, she was out. And the message was clear. In the Holloway family, loyalty to Richard was the price of admission, and Maggie was no longer willing to pay it. But in the middle of all that loss, in the middle of watching an entire family turn its back on her, there was one person whose choice mattered more than all the others combined. There was one person whose decision about where to stand and who to stand with would determine whether Maggie's story ended in devastation or in something resembling hope. And that person was Sophie. In the weeks after the trial, Sophie Holloway started seeing a therapist named Dr. Janet Reeves, a psychologist in Charlotte who specialized in adolescent trauma. Sophie was 17 by then, and she was struggling in ways that were visible to everyone around her: weight loss, insomnia, panic attacks in the school bathroom between classes, a grade point average that had dropped from a 3.8 to a 2.4 in a single semester. Dr. Reeves diagnosed Sophie with generalized anxiety disorder and complex grief. And she explained to Maggie that Sophie's grief was not a straightforward kind of grief, not the kind you feel when someone dies, but the kind you feel when the person you loved turns out to have never existed. Sophie was grieving the father she thought she had. She was grieving the family she thought she belonged to, and she was grieving the version of herself that existed before she found that phone in her father's truck. The version of herself that was innocent and unburdened and did not carry the weight of a secret that was too heavy for a grown adult, let alone a 14-year-old girl. Dr. Reeves helped Sophie understand something that would take months to fully sink in but would ultimately save her relationship with her mother. She helped Sophie understand that keeping her father's secret was not a moral failing. It was a survival response. When a child is placed in an impossible situation by a parent, when a child is told that speaking the truth will cause the destruction of everything they love, the child does not make a rational decision to stay silent. The child's nervous system takes over. The child goes into a kind of emotional lockdown where the only priority is preventing the catastrophe, and the truth becomes the enemy because the truth is the thing that will make the bad thing happen. Sophie had not chosen to betray her mother. Now Sophie had been manipulated into silence by a man who understood exactly what he was doing when he placed that burden on his daughter's shoulders. Richard knew that Sophie loved Maggie more than anyone in the world, and he used that love as a weapon. He told Sophie that her silence was an act of love, that keeping the secret was protecting her mother. And Sophie believed him because she was a child, and he was her father. and the alternative was too terrifying to consider. One evening in November, about 4 months after the trial, Sophie came downstairs from her room. Maggie was sitting on the couch in the living room, watching something on television that she was not actually watching because her mind was somewhere else, the way her mind was always somewhere else in those days. Sophie sat down next to her. She did not say anything for a long time. The television played. The house was quiet. And then Sophie reached over and took her mother's hand, the way she used to do when she was 5 years old and they were crossing a parking lot, and she said, "Mom, I am ready to start over, but I only want to start over with you." Maggie squeezed her daughter's hand, and she did not speak, because she could not speak, because every word in the English language felt too small for what she was feeling. And so, she just held on to Sophie's hand, and they sat there on the couch in the quiet house. And for the first time since that Tuesday morning in April, Maggie felt something warm inside her chest that was not pain. She could not name it yet. It would take months before she could identify it as hope. But it was there, small and fragile, and flickering like a candle in a room that had been dark for a very long time. Maggie Holloway sold the house in Mint Hill in February of 2020. She sold it at a loss because the market was not great and because she could not stand to spend one more day in a house that was haunted by memories she could no longer trust. Every room had a ghost in it. The kitchen where she had read the letter, the bedroom where Richard had told her he loved her 10,000 times without meaning it once, the driveway where Sophie had sat in the truck with her father and agreed to carry a secret that would slowly eat her alive. Maggie took what was left of the restitution money, combined it with the small amount of savings that Richard had not managed to steal, and she moved to Asheville, North Carolina, a city in the Blue Ridge Mountains that she had visited once on a weekend trip with her sisters years earlier, and had always thought of as a place where people go to start over. She chose Asheville because it was far enough from Charlotte that she would not run into anyone who knew her story, and close enough to Shelby that her mother Lorraine could visit. She chose it because it was beautiful, and because she needed beauty after so much ugliness. She chose it because the mountains made her feel small in a way that was comforting instead of crushing. Because when you are standing at the base of a mountain that has been there for 300 million years, your problems feel less permanent. Maggie enrolled in a master's program in counseling psychology at a university in Asheville. She was 44 years old. She was the oldest person in most of her classes. She sat in lectures about attachment theory and trauma responses and cognitive behavioral therapy, and she realized that she was not just studying these concepts academically. She was studying the blueprint of her own life. She was learning the clinical names for what Richard had done to her. She was learning that what she experienced had a name, betrayal trauma, and that it was recognized by psychologists as a distinct form of psychological injury that affects the brain's ability to trust, to feel safe, to regulate emotions, to form healthy attachments. She was learning that the symptoms she had been experiencing, the insomnia, the hypervigilance, the inability to make simple decisions without second-guessing herself, the way she flinched every time her phone rang, were not signs that she was broken. They were signs that her nervous system was doing exactly what it was designed to do in the aftermath of profound betrayal. And understanding that, naming it, studying it, gave Maggie something that Richard had stolen from her. It gave her back her sense of agency. It gave her back the feeling that her own story made sense, that she was not crazy, that what happened to her was real and it was wrong, and she had every right to feel the way she felt. Sophie graduated from high school in Asheville in 2021. She gave a speech at graduation that she did not tell Maggie about in advance. And in that speech, she said, "I spent 2 years of my life carrying a secret that I thought would destroy my family. And it did destroy my family. But it also showed me that the only thing worse than a painful truth is a comfortable lie. And I would rather live in the truth, even when it hurts, than spend one more day pretending." Maggie was sitting in the third row of the auditorium, and she cried so hard that Linda had to hand her an entire pack of tissues. Sophie started college at UNC Greensboro that fall. She calls Maggie every single day. They do not talk about Richard. Emma, the younger daughter, took longer to come around. She was angry for a long time. Angry at Richard for what he did. Angry at Maggie for blowing up the family. angry at Sophie for knowing and not telling. Angry at the world for not being the safe and predictable place she had believed it was when she was 12 years old, and her biggest problem was math homework. Emma went to therapy. She resisted it at first, and then she embraced it, and then she resisted it again because healing is not a straight line. It is a winding road with switchbacks and dead ends, and days when you feel like you are right back where you started. But Emma came around. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly, she came around. She and Maggie are rebuilding their relationship one conversation at a time, and Maggie says that she is okay with slow because slow is honest, and honest is the only thing she is interested in anymore. Maggie graduated from her master's program in 2023. She now runs a small private practice in Asheville that specializes in one thing: helping women who have experienced betrayal trauma, women who discovered their husbands were cheating, women who found out their families had been lying to them, women who trusted the wrong person and lost everything and are trying to figure out how to rebuild a life on a foundation that feels like sand. Maggie says that every single client who walks through her door reminds her of herself sitting on that kitchen floor in April of 2019, and that is exactly why she does this work. Because nobody came for her. Nobody told her the truth. Nobody warned her. And she wants to be the person she did not have. The person who sits across from you and says, "I believe you. It was not your fault, and you are going to survive this." Denise Alderman stayed in Valdosta. She kept the house with the blue front door and the magnolia tree because her children had grown up there, and it was the only home they knew, and she was not going to let Richard take that from them the way he had taken everything else. She and Maggie exchange emails every few months. They are not exactly friends in the traditional sense because there is too much shared pain for a normal friendship to grow in that soil. But there is something between them that is deeper than friendship in some ways. A mutual recognition, a shared understanding that they are the only two people in the world who know exactly what the other one went through, because they went through it together, from opposite sides of the same lie. Denise went back to nursing school. She had started a nursing degree before she met Richard, and had dropped out when Tyler was born because Richard said he made enough money for both of them, and she should focus on the kids. After the trial, she enrolled again. She graduated in 2022 and now works at a hospital in Valdosta. She remarried in 2023, a man named James, and he's a high school football coach, and he is quiet and steady, and he knew Denise's entire story before their third date, because Denise told him everything on their second date and said, "If this is too much for you, I understand, but I am done keeping secrets, and I am done being with anyone who asks me to." James did not leave. He came back for the third date with flowers and a handwritten note that said, "Your past is not a deal breaker. Now it is proof of how strong you are." Denise keeps that note in her wallet. When asked about Richard, Denise says one thing. She says, "He took 14 years from me. I am not giving him a single day more." And then she changes the subject because Richard Holloway has already taken up enough space in her story, and she is not interested in giving him any more. When Maggie Holloway speaks about what happened to her now, she does not speak with the raw, bleeding pain of the early days. She does not speak with bitterness or rage, although she has earned the right to both. She speaks with the steady, clear-eyed calm of a woman who has walked through the worst storm of her life and come out on the other side not unscathed, but standing. And there is a difference between being unscathed and being standing that only people who have been through something like this can understand. She says, "The hardest part was not losing my husband. I know that sounds strange, but it is true. That by the time I understood who Richard really was, I did not want him anymore. The man I loved never existed. He was a character Richard played for 18 years, and you cannot mourn a character. The money was devastating, especially my father's inheritance, and I will carry that loss for the rest of my life. But the hardest part, the part that almost broke me, was losing my ability to trust. Not just trust in Richard, trust in myself, trust in my own judgment. And I had looked at this man every single day for 18 years, and I did not see it. I did not see any of it. And that made me question everything, every decision I had ever made, every person I had ever believed, every instinct I had ever followed. If I could be that wrong about the person sleeping next to me, then what else was I wrong about? That is what betrayal does. It does not just take away the person who lied to you. It takes away your confidence in your own ability to know what is real. She pauses when she says this, the way she always pauses at this point in the story, as if she is checking in with herself to see if the next words are ready to come out. And then she says, "But here is what I have learned. I have learned it from my own experience, and I have learned it from every woman who has sat in my office and told me her story. Betrayal does not define you. It reveals you. It does not show you who they are, because who they are is their problem and their burden. It shows you who you are. And I found out that I am someone who can lose everything she believed in and still get up in the morning and make breakfast for her daughters and drive to class and study and graduate and build a practice and help other women and laugh again and feel joy again and trust again. Not the same way I trusted before, not blindly, not recklessly, but wisely, carefully, with my eyes open. And I found out that my daughters are extraordinary human beings who inherited my strength and not their father's weakness. And I found out that my sisters and my mother are the kind of people who show up when it matters and do not leave until you tell them to. And I found out that starting over at 44 is terrifying, but it is also the most honest thing I have ever done, because this time I am building my life on truth instead of someone else's lies." She takes a breath. And then she says the thing that gives this channel its name. She says, "Being betrayed is a thing that happened to me. But being beyond betrayed? That is a thing I chose. And it is the best choice I have ever made." I want to leave you with a few questions today. Not because I have the answers. I do not think anyone does. I think these are the kinds of questions that live in the space between right and wrong, where most real life actually happens. Was justice served? Richard Holloway got 4 years. He will be out in less time than that with good behavior. Maggie got a lifetime of rebuilding. Denise got 14 years of stolen time. Sophie got 2 years of carrying a grown man's secret on the shoulders of a child. Emma got a childhood that ended the day she found out her father was not who she thought he was. Is 4 years enough for all of that? Is any sentence enough? And here's the harder question, the one I want you to really sit with. Now, if you discovered that someone in your family was living a double life, that your brother or your father or your son was married to 2 women at the same time and was stealing from one to support the other, would you tell? Would you pick up the phone and call the woman who did not know and say the words that would destroy her world, even though destroying her world might be the only way to save her from a bigger destruction later? Or would you stay silent the way Patricia did for 11 years, and Karen did for 5, and Sophie did for 2, because the truth felt too heavy to carry and too dangerous to release? There is no right answer. But I want to hear yours. Tell me in the comments. I want to leave you with a few questions today. Not because I have the answers. I do not think anyone does. I think these are the kinds of questions that live in the space between right and wrong, where most real life actually happens. Was justice served? Richard Holloway got 4 years. He will be out in less time than that with good behavior. Maggie got a lifetime of rebuilding. Denise got 14 years of stolen time. Sophie got 2 years of carrying a grown man's secret on the shoulders of a child. Emma got a childhood that ended the day she found out her father was not who she thought he was. Is 4 years enough for all of that? Is any sentence enough? And here's the harder question, the one I want you to really sit with. If you discovered that someone in your family was living a double life, that your brother or your father or your son was married to 2 women at the same time and was stealing from one to support the other, would you tell? Would you pick up the phone and call the woman who did not know and say the words that would destroy her world, even though destroying her world might be the only way to save her from a bigger destruction later? Or would you stay silent the way Patricia did for 11 years, and Karen did for 5, and Sophie did for 2, because the truth felt too heavy to carry and too dangerous to release? There is no right answer, but I want to hear yours. Tell me in the comments. If something in today's story felt familiar, if you saw yourself in Maggie standing on that kitchen floor, or in Sophie crying on her bedroom carpet, or in Denise sitting on her front porch with a glass of sweet tea, trying to make sense of a life that had been a lie, I want you to know something. You are not alone. You have never been alone, even in the moments when loneliness felt like the only thing that was real. This channel exists because every person who has been betrayed by the people closest to them deserves to hear a story that does not end with the betrayal. A story that goes further. A story that shows what happens after the worst part, after the crying and the anger and the sleepless nights and the questioning of everything you ever believed. This channel exists because the story does not end when you find the letter in the mailbox. The story ends when you decide what to do next. And what Maggie did next, what Denise did next, what Sophie did next, is proof that the worst thing that ever happened to you does not have to be the last thing that defines you. You are not what was done to you. You are not the lies you were told, or the secrets you were forced to keep, or the money that was stolen, or the trust that was broken. You are what you choose to do with what is left. And what is left is you. Whole, breathing, standing, real. That is not just survival. That is something more. That is being beyond betrayed. And we will see you in the next one.